I'm your host, Darren Burrell.
And I'm your co-host, Patrick McIntyre.
We will explore the stories from our conscious collection of music, books, and film.
The ones that have shaped our lives.
Join us as we take a closer look at what remains.
Welcome to Remainders, where we talk about better living through stories. My name is Patrick.
And I'm Darren.
And today we're going to be talking about the 2007 film There Will Be Blood. Directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, the movie is the story of oilman Daniel Plainview, played by Daniel Day-Lewis. Set at the turn of the 20th century, it's the story of the growth of greed, aspiration, religion, and of course, the rise of capitalism. If it's the theme and quality of a story that dictate the great American novel, then I think There Will Be Blood is certainly a good contender for the great American film. What's more American than selling capitalism and religion?
If you're anything like me, you've seen this film probably a million times. I mean, it is so great. Obviously, Daniel Day-Lewis is so great. And I was remarking as I was watching it last night about how does any actor really get into a role and say, I'm going to be playing opposite Daniel Day-Lewis and feel good about that? You know, like they must be excited, but also completely terrified because of how great he is. And that's like no joke. Whenever people talk about how good Daniel Day-Lewis is, it's really true. I mean, it's impossible to watch a film with him and him not command every single time he gets on the screen. I think Paul Dano, who plays Eli Sunday, does a great job of being a nemesis, really. This is really a story of good versus evil and how good gets corrupted, really, in the end. I heard this was based on an Upton Sinclair novel, but really just loosely based. We're going to talk about a lot of themes in this film, one being religion, which is, I think, pretty at the forefront, but also, as you said, capitalism, and really at a time when people had to work very hard and be very competitive to make sure that they were the number one choice when it comes to this new liquid gold, which was oil.
It is based on the book Oil by Upton Sinclair. He's the author of The Jungle that I mentioned in a previous episode. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. So it is loosely adapted. Basically, like the first portion of Oil is about the story of Plainview and his son as an oilman pursuing power and wealth at the turn of the century in America. And it is a great book. It just is very different. Like Paul Thomas Anderson, he definitely has made it clear that it was just like a foundational piece that he used to spring his own movie. So like he's by no means trying to adapt that story. You just use it as a source material. The book itself goes a little bit more into the way power and wealth rise to the top in America. You know, and that's a theme in the movie, but it's certainly what Upton Sinclair focused on in basically all of his writings back in the 20s.
What does oil do? It generates energy, right? And therefore life. The title in itself, There Will Be Blood, oil can be looked at as a parallel to blood, right? The life source in all humans. Daniel survives the first brush with death in the first opening scenes where he's alone. He's really not with a lot of people. And I think the theme of him as a loner is gone throughout. And in fact, when more people come into his life, the more problems that just start to happen. He's a very dedicated character. He's competitive. He talks about that in the film, that he has a competition in him, which is such a great scene. When he has that first brush with death and he survives, I almost feel like that is a little bit of a curse on him, that now he has to spend the rest of his life pursuing this life, this blood, this oil, and stop at nothing to get it because he has survived. And you see, as time goes on, that some of the workers that have worked with him die. Destruction is kind of in his wake as time goes on. Death and destruction are in his path as he's on his path to amassing this fortune in liquid gold.
It's that self-imposed isolation. It's certainly his goal. He has a competition and he just basically wants to make enough money that he can get away from everybody. So it's like this self-imposed isolation that he sees as where he will find happiness. We do start the movie. It's 1898, and we see him digging around for oil. I love this movie largely because of the first 15 minutes and how it just opens up as a silent film.
Doesn't it feel a little bit like Once Upon a Time in the West, where it's like the things that you hear are so important in those first 15 minutes because there's no dialogue. It's just him, and you can, the creaks, the sound, except for that amazing score for the character by Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead fame, and we've talked about Radiohead in the past with Daniel Johnston episode. That whole 15 minutes is so, like, you're just captivated, and there's something to be said about that. Again, the Sergio Leone way of tracking all of those sound bites in the beginning of Once Upon a Time in the West. I feel like maybe Paul Thomas Anderson was inspired by that a little bit here because of the way that he realized the minimalist way of scoring the beginning of this was going to be so dramatic.
Well, I was going to ask you, when was the last time you've seen The Treasure of Sierra Madre?
That is probably my favorite John Huston movie, and I've seen it a lot. I recently saw it about 2 weeks ago. TCM was playing it. The Bogart character in that is such a scoundrel, or at least becomes corrupted by the gold, by the potential of the monetary wealth that he can get from the gold that they're digging, that all of a sudden he becomes the biggest criminal to get whatever he wants. He becomes infiltrated by the greed. And I feel like there's so many parallels in this film with Treasure Sierra Madre. So is that something that you were going to talk about?
It's certainly one of Anderson's biggest influence for this film and just kind of like his style overall, John Huston being one of his favorite directors. But all the components of American cinema, like the stealing, the corruption, the pursuit of wealth, the open fields, and the sense of freedom, especially with Treasure of Sierra Madre, it all seems to be like pretty prominent part of especially that film, Treasure of Sierra Madre. And you definitely see The Blood is like a prequel to that, being set at the turn of the century and setting it up for what it's going to be in John Huston's films.
I love what you said about the freedom of the sort of the landscape. I had not thought of that before because of how many shots are really pulled back so you can see how big, this wide open space is, yet it does feel so claustrophobic when they're in that well or in that mine. Also in Treasure Sierra Madre, like the biggest joke of that movie is all the things that they're doing to go out and get this gold and how many things they have to do to get it, and by the end, with Bogart coming so close to the finish line, he finally makes it, and he's just to be killed and left in the ditch by the Mexican bandits that are there. I mean, that's the biggest irony. This film, not to get ahead of ourselves, but the film opens almost exactly how it closes on Daniel Plainview. He's almost in the exact same spot with all of this insane amount of work and all this insane amount of character development goes on to fill in the gaps from. It almost bookends the exact same story from beginning to end.
So within the first 20 minutes of the movie, a baby is christened with oil on his forehead. He's being baptized with oil. And more than anything else, I think this kind of sums up the movie for me. Already the movie is about capitalism, where he's searching for oil, and then you bring in this religious element of just the baby being christened with the oil that they just discovered. And essentially how our country is built upon those two things as the ultimate form of worship. Either make money or praise God, and sometimes they cross over. And I think that's all encapsulated with that first scene of with the baby being christened with the oil.
Wow, what a big thing to think of. Our country is built on religion and money. And this movie tells the story of both.
Yeah, and that's why already with that one scene, you already know what you're getting yourself into. I mean, I certainly didn't recognize that the first time watching it. I've as you said, I watched this probably 30 times. As I got older and watch it a little bit more, you just see how much those themes are in there, but they're kind of like on a deep-seated level, but at the same time, they're on the surface. And so that moment that baby is christened with the oil, what I love is that it cuts right to the baby's father being killed, and then he's basically in Daniel's care right after that. So he gets christened with oil. It's basically him being led directly to Plainview, the ultimate capitalist.
I think that Paul Thomas Anderson was like, okay, with naming these characters, we're going to just go straight for it. Like Plainview, just a plain view of like right to the money. That's my life goal, is that I don't have any kind of thing to infiltrate it. And Daniel Plainview, that's it. But Eli Sunday, right in his name, is religion, right? The Sunday Ranch, it's really like the epicenter of religion. And those two characters, I don't think that was any accident they were named that way.
No, not at all. Yeah.
You know, like Daniel Plainview, a dedicated, determined, competitive, ordinary man, really. We don't know much about him. We get a glimpse of his backstory. But, you know, he becomes very rich by striking oil in the early days of digging for wells. But he's a loner, you know. The film opens on just him, isolated, alone. In many ways, you know, it begins how it ends, as I mentioned. I feel like he's just meant to be alone, and he doesn't like people. This is first apparent when his future son is adopted. That's what I wanted to get to with you talking about H.W. Because he's brought into his life from his father dying. And what is Daniel's first thought? I can use this to further my plight to making money. Because he uses H.W. to portray himself as a good family man to the townspeople that he goes and sees, to convince them and to really manipulate. He's constantly manipulating people in this film, which, by the way, all businessmen and women do. They're constantly manipulating you to get what they want for themselves, you know, because he's obviously a very self-centered, he just wants it for himself, is what I'm trying to say. In the scene in the town hall, HW's sitting in back of him, right? So Daniel's like clear in the front, and HW's in the back, just sort of looking on all of the people in the crowd. And it's like, here we are, here's your portrait of your family that in this town, and I'm one of you. You can trust us. So let us come in and dig. And I love how that scene where everybody's up in arms and he just walks out. You know, that's like such a businessman thing to do, too, is to say, okay, I don't need this. I don't need this. Although in that also is a further way of manipulating him to say, wait, we want you, you know, like furthering their need for him.
No, I mean, that's all such a great point. Yeah, so he adopts HW, and HW is a commodity. He exists only as a way for Daniel to make money, and we'll get into it later, but like once HW is unable to continue to help him to profit for reasons after an accident, you know, that's when it turns for the worse for Daniel, and we'll get into that more. But yeah, so HW exists only as a commodity, as a way to make Daniel money. As he said, my wife died in childbirth. When he's selling himself as an oilman, this is the image of the family man that's kind of pushed forward through religion. That's his way of placating that image. And I love that so much that you brought that up. So Paul Sunday shows up, leading Daniel to the Sunday Ranch. And as you said, it's a perfect metaphor. It's the holy day, the Sunday Ranch, the holy day of worship. Paul has two things to say. I know where the oil is, and what church do you belong to? So it already sets up what
I belong to many.
Yeah,
I like them all.
That is such a great diplomatic response of a businessman. You know, he doesn't give a shit about anything, but he's going to, he's going to hold up a book like Trump holds up a book, like I support books.
Right. Yep, absolutely. And I think that scene too, just to talk about it a little further, if you don't mind, Eli Sunday is really, I guess you would say, the foil character to Daniel Day-Lewis's character. But what Pat is mentioning is that his brother. And we see it's his twin brother, which I didn't realize this. They had another actor cast as Paul Sunday, but I guess it didn't work, which happens on sets, and there was no chemistry between Daniel Day-Lewis and him. So they had to recast it, but they decided Paul Dano was so good, he could just do both roles and it would be like a twin brother. So I remember seeing this the first time, and actually that doesn't work for me. I remember being very confused seeing it upon the first view. Maybe I was just too young and dumb to understand what was really happening, because there's a lot to take in this movie, of course.
Yeah, I remember being confused by it too, for sure. So
yeah, that's one criticism I have about doing that. Now, as I know it, it doesn't really matter to me so much, but upon first watch, it's a little confusing. But that being said, doesn't matter, because that scene is ridiculously good. And as you said, yeah, it's like a poker game between the two. Like immediately, you see Daniel at his desk, and he walks in, Paul Sunday walks in, and it's kind of like they both don't know how to read each other, but they're constantly trying to get Paul to give them the information so they can go and get what they want without having to pay him for the information. Paul, as we find out later, Daniel gives it to Eli, his brother, and says, Paul was the smart one. Paul's the one who came to me. So this is a scene that's really setting that up. My favorite line, and this is, you get so much of who Daniel Day-Lewis is in this line, where he says, if I go all the way up there and I find that there's no oil there, I'm going to take more than my money back. Is that all right with you? Like, he asked if it's all right with you, basically saying, I'm going to kick the fucking shit out of you or I'm going to kill you, you know? Yeah. And in like a very diplomatic way to him. And he's like, that's all right with me. And I can't believe how good that scene is. It's just beautiful. He sees the opportunity to work and see what happens. So they go up there with HW and Daniel. They go up to the Sunday Ranch to shoot quail and to really survey the land. Again, constantly pretending to be somebody he's not to get what he wants.
And that definitely sets up the dubious nature of him as a businessman and how he set out not to be a moral businessman. He's set out to make money. So he sets out to, as you said, hunt quail with his son. They go to the Sunday Ranch, and they eventually discover the oil. And he's explaining to HW how to acquire the land and the process that would follow. So, like, they found oil on this land that they don't own, and he's explaining it to him. And as he's explaining that to him, he's pointing out that not letting the Sunday family know about the oil is kind of the key to them profiting from it. You know, he says, we certainly won't give them oil prices. We'll give them quail prices. And you see HW's face, even he's an 8-year-old kid, and you even see him like, well, that seems like immoral, and like you're just going to be taking land, whatnot, from other people. But this is what you got to do to make a profit, as Daniel sees it.
100%. And again, he doesn't say anything to Daniel, but you can see it on his face. And I wrote a note about that scene as well, because I think Daniel finally finds somebody he can trust in HW, and he's sort of molding him to be another Daniel Plainview, as all of our fathers have done. They try to have the son fall in the footsteps, you know, even though he's not his real son, he's adopted son, but HW doesn't know that. So he's got a different disposition than Daniel does, and you can see that on his face in that scene. I think that's really good because, yeah, they're shooting for quail on this land, and while that's all innocent at this time, as soon as it starts to come into how do we make a deal with these people, we're going to give them quail prices. We're going to basically steal their land and make a huge profit. He doesn't think that that's so right.
The twin brother who is actually living on the ranch, Eli Sunday, he's the only one who sees the actual opportunity there for the oil and the money. And his first reaction to that is, how can the oil and the money and the profits grow the church that he wants to open? And so that really kind of sets up the merging of capitalism and religion here, and how sometimes they work against each other and how sometimes they work for each other.
Well, and think about this. As soon as you hear Eli say that, I want money for my church, Daniel goes into manipulation mode. He knows, okay, this is what this guy wants. I'm going to lie and tell him whatever he wants so that I can get what I want. But it's almost like a negative for Eli to bring that up, because as soon as Daniel finds out what he can manipulate, he goes right for the jugular with it. And then you see another scene where he's talking about all the land around the Sunday Ranch, and he's trying to buy it, and he says the line, "Can everything around here be got?"
Yeah, I love that.
That's a great line, because it's not just talking about the land, he's talking about the people.
Right.
You know what
That's
I mean?
a good point.
Can everything around here be got? And so that starts in the whole process of, really, for the rest of the story, it revolves around the Sunday Ranch and digging up the oil around that area, because, as he says, there's an ocean of oil underneath our feet.
Yeah, and so once they do get to a point where he starts moving in on Little Boston, it's Little Boston, California is where they're at. They have this kind of montage where Daniel is preaching to the people. It's like, this is what I'm going to be able to deliver to you. He preaches the economic growth the same way that Eli preaches God. He's talking to the people about education, agriculture, opportunity, which are, all good things, but he's really selling it like a politician. Things are essential, but the practice is obviously only something that's going to use up the land, and the wealth is going to travel up to the top and not necessarily be for the people who own the land or previously owned the land. And it really kind of reminded me, like, with that scene, it's like, it's really capitalism and religion. It's about recruiting members, either to capitalism or to God. As Daniel is recruiting people with the promise of profits, Eli recruits followers to his church.
It becomes so much of an aggravation to Daniel as these little scenes that we see with people from the church pinning crosses on the oil people's lapels and things like that, and you can just see Daniel seething about it because it's like this whole idea of religion in the town is like something he's rejecting wholeheartedly. It's like a transplant in his body that is being rejected. Even the scene where Mary comes and says, Mary is a little girl who is Mary Sunday, and she is HW's age, and so she sort of plays with him and stuff, and she tells HW that my father beats me when I don't pray, which it's almost in that scene you think Daniel's kind of a hero, that he has like some good in him because he really thinks that's an injustice. And so in front of the father who beats Mary when she doesn't pray, he makes a point to say, no more hitting, we're not going to be hit anymore, like almost as like a check and balance to the father, like, I'm in control here and you're not going to hit this little girl anymore. It's completely Daniel controlling every single scene, and the minute that Daniel isn't in control is the minute things start to be a problem.
Well, it's the first glimpse of him officially coming in, being like, I'm actually your savior.
Right.
You know, you've been preaching to God. Eli's trying to get you to preach to this new God, this new church, but I'm actually the one who's going to be able to save you.
Right.
As you said, Daniel's not having any of Eli's religious bullshit. I love the scene when Eli performs an exorcism at his new church. He's really hamming it up for the town folks. He basically exorcises a demon from an old lady. And right after that, Daniel's reaction, he's kind of laughing at it, but his quote is, "That was one goddamn hell of a show." And you could just tell that, like, this is his reaction. Like, he recognizes, even though he may not recognize he's a showman, he recognizes that Eli is a showman trying to sell something.
Just the expressions on Daniel Day-Lewis's face in that scene, too. He doesn't say anything, really. He's just kind of like taking it all in when that scene is happening. And you're right. I remember first seeing that scene and thinking Paul Dano is like overacting, but I realized that's the point.
Yeah.
The point is to overact so that it becomes such a show.
You got to sell it
as a false prophet. And then the thing that I wanted to mention that we kind of skipped just a pinch of, to bless the well before they start digging.
Well, that's that scene. That's when Eli, right when he says that, that's when Eli is asking, I'm happy.
He's not asking, though. He's not asking. He's telling him, and that's the point, I think. He's saying, I'm going to come and show up, and I'm going to be blessing this well, and I think you can call me up right before you say this, and he's dictating the situation. And Daniel, of course, in the background is like, no. This is my show. But he says, okay, very well. Sounds good. What time do you think, Eli? What time do you think? He's basically telling him and saying, I'm going to do everything you want. And then when the day and the moment comes, completely bypasses him, does not even recognize him.
And I love just that shot of just Eli's face as the celebratory music comes on. He's got the shit-eating grin on his face, but at the same time, he knows this is going to be his foil coming up. So yeah, the oil is flowing. This kind of leads up to striking of oil. And the gasket blows. It's the first strike of oil, but HW is hurt in the accident and loses his hearing. I love this scene for so many reasons. Like, the Greenwood score is absolutely perfect with the oil fire blazing in the night. Like I said, it's definitely one of my favorite parts of the movie, and it kind of captures Daniel's character for the most part that we've seen at this point. And he says, there's a whole ocean of oil underneath our feet, and nobody can get at it except for me. He's staring right at all this destruction, including the fire. His son is like maybe coming close to death, and all he sees right now is success.
The scene that happened right before that is that another oil person does die right after the well is not blessed. And so Eli uses that against Daniel and says, hey, you didn't let me bless this, and now look at all the death and destruction, which is just to the 10th degree done up when HW loses his hearing. And if you notice throughout the movie now, anytime somebody mentions HW, which is really the only failure that Daniel sees that in his life. It's his son, because his son has now a problem. He can't hear, which reflects on Daniel. For whatever reason, Daniel thinks that that's my shortcoming, because my son can't hear. And everybody uses it in different ways and says, hey, don't you wish you could have all this money? We could buy this land from you and you'll be fine. You can have all this money. You'll be a millionaire, and you can spend some time with your son. And it just gets at him. It gnaws at him. It excites the competition in him even more, because he's like, nobody's going to tell me how to raise my son. Nobody's going to use anything against me. It's really a fire that burns within him. And you see, as you mentioned, HW loses his hearing, and he doesn't know what to do with him. There's even that scene where he puts a ton of whiskey in his milk so that he'll fall asleep, so he doesn't have to bother with him. Ultimately, he ends up sending him away so that he can continue to do his work in the town. But yeah, there's a lot that is built into that with him losing his hearing. And you're right, the score in that whole scene, him carrying him and hugging him and holding him and like brushing his hair back and saying it's going to be okay. It's like such a pivotal scene, because when he comes back out and tells HW, I'll be right back, he does say that line, there's an ocean of oil underneath our feet and nobody can get at it but me. He says to the guy, he's like, what are you looking so sorry about?
No, that gets to a good point that I was kind of like, not struggled with, but like his reaction to the relationship with HW after the accident. It's kind of accurate the way you said it. It's like he sees it as his only point of failure, like his inability to either protect them or to use him anymore to profit for the business. Coming up soon is when he sends them away.
Getting into then the scene where Daniel and Eli sort of come to a head, because Eli does come to tell him, you didn't let me bless the well, and look at all these things that are happening. You see him walk past this like spill off of oil, and he's walking to Daniel, and you just see in Daniel's face, he's like, I'm gonna bury this guy. And he says it, I'm gonna bury you under the ground, Eli. This scene is huge. Daniel slaps him like a little child and is like hunkering over him and literally drowning him in the oil. He drags him across to the dirt and he smears his face in it. He says, roll around in that for a while, Eli. Smearing it on his face, almost like the anti-baptism, man. He's cursing him in it. He's shoving his face in Daniel's success. I got you. I'm beating you. And he's clearly upset that HW has become deaf. While he's in full control, he knows that Eli is using this, your son is now deaf. And that, again, this is the whole point. At this point, he has no problem revealing who he really is to Eli.
He dunks on Eli pretty hard, dragging him through the mud and the oil, letting him bask in the failure of religion. At this point, the money is winning. Eli's pissed that between money and religion right now, money is winning. As I said, they work together sometimes, but they also work for each other. And it's really more about what you worship. America is kind of built upon worshiping one or the other. And that's kind of like them, as you said, coming to the head.
So he has a possible brother that comes to see him. Just a great character. The character really is trying to infiltrate him based on Daniel Plainview's actual brother, who he says had died of tuberculosis. And so he sort of took on the role to pretend he's his brother so he can come in and manipulate Daniel. And Daniel's weary of it, but kind of goes along with it and starts to think, well, maybe this is my brother, right? But during that scene, we have a scene outside where Daniel's getting drunk with him. And this is where we first get to see a little bit of who Daniel Plainview is. And he starts to say the famous line, I have a competition in me. You know, I want no one else to succeed, hate most people, and things like that. You get to see this character in ways we hadn't yet. He's getting his most vulnerable, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Your impersonation of Plainview is fantastic, I just want to say, by the way. Yeah. I really feel like I'm revisiting the film, even though I just watched it last night.
Oh, amazing. Thanks.
As you're mentioning that, so Henry is the imposter brother who shows up. And you find out pretty soon that he's an imposter, but you get to see glimpses of Plainview, of Daniel maybe seeing. Like there's a potential for me connecting with another person, with one of my family members. And it's just hitting me like right now, it's like the only two characters that he even comes close to aren't even his own family members. You know, he adopted HW as a way to make more money. Henry is an imposter that at no point did Daniel ever even consider wanting to get close to a brother, but this happened, but it wasn't even his real brother to begin with. And these are like the only two people who even come close to being part of his life and somebody he would be willing to sacrifice for. And it turns out both of them are basically illusions.
Well, I just want to talk about this great scene here between Henry and Daniel. So they're going to find Bandy, who is the only land he hasn't got, right? It's an older man who doesn't want to give up his land, and they want to build a pipeline to sort of have the oil flow out and therefore make more money. But Bandy won't sell. And so there he goes out with Henry. Daniel goes out with Henry to try to convince him, right? And so at this point, we see them stop at the ocean to kind of let loose for a little bit, relax before they go on to their next spot. And they're also sort of surveying the land as they go. There's this scene that starts where the camera is in the water with both of them, and it's under the water and above the water, so half and half. And you're sort of seeing this like blurred vision of what's going on, and then you see them have a discussion on the beach, and Daniel talks about something from back home that he thinks his brother would know. Now, it's good to note at this point that Henry has an idea of what's going on because he's able to read Daniel's actual brother's journal, like it's sort of his diary. And so he's able to read a lot about growing up and stuff like that. So he's a really good imposter.
Yeah.
Because he has inside information based on a real brother that did this stuff. At that moment, I feel like we are seeing in Daniel's face that he got it. At this moment, we see that Daniel knows it's not his brother and that something needs to be done, that he's being tricked, and it's just in his face. Again, it's all in Daniel Day-Lewis's face, which Paul Thomas Anderson, of course, directs beautifully. The very next scene, and I don't know if like you love this as much as I do, but now we see Daniel back in the water because instead of blowing up or doing anything and like getting at him right now, he goes back into the water. And we just see him seething, looking out at him in the water as he's just wading and treading water. And there's a wave that's coming behind him, a huge wave. And then that goes into the next scene where he's watching Henry, getting drunk at the bar. And Henry comes up and says, "Give me some money." And we just know, Daniel knows now, and he's going to do something about it.
I mean, that's the master of Paul Thomas Anderson, is that he's able to convey all those emotions, all those feelings of him, like, suspecting that it's not actually his brother, and you see it just, like, unfold without any, like, you know, direct lines about it, and you just see it, as you said, in his face. Like, when he's hunched over on the beach, and he's kind of looking over just, like, momentarily at Henry, and you can, like, hear him, like, even, like, move his mouth, just, like, he's saying no, maybe. Like, he's not saying anything, but he's just kind of moving his mouth. It's incredibly shot.
Yeah, incredibly shot. You're right. This whole moment leads up to him and Henry finally getting back to their camp. No one else is around. And honestly, this scene is more terrifying to me than maybe any horror movie I've seen. Lit entirely by a fire on their faces in the middle of nowhere. And you know who this character of Daniel Plainview is and how much malice he has in him and hatred. And now he knows that he's being duped. He knows definitively. And it's like, what's going to happen? And just the way that he asks these questions. Do I have a brother, you know? Like, and he's just getting every little bit that he knows he needs to get out of him before he's going to ultimately kill him. And the way that he kills him by holding his face like that and shooting him, and then the way that he dies, that you can just hear him gasping for air, and like, it's incredibly shocking to me. I don't know if you felt that same way about that scene.
Yeah, no, I mean, you see, as you say, you see him writhe in pain. It almost looks like he just, like, shoots the gun to the side. Like, you don't actually see him, like, shoot him in the head or anything, but he just kind of does it, like, in this almost intimate way of, like, just, like, putting him to sleep with his gun.
That's well said. That's why I think it's so psychologically jarring, because, he's got it. He's almost like, shh, you know, like, go to sleep here. Yeah, and the way he puts his hand on his face and stuff like that. And it's just Daniel complete control the whole time. The way it's shot, the way that Henry's on the ground, it's like there's no way out. There's really no way out for Henry. Like, he can't talk his way out. He can't move his way out. He's just doomed.
And he wakes up to Bandy. who's ready to force him into repent for his sins, and which leads him back to Eli Sunday.
That's true. Bandy comes to Daniel and tells him he must be baptized to get the pipeline to go through his land. He doesn't care about the money. Daniel's like, he would rather do... And by the way, Daniel's completely hungover because he sits there and reads all night the actual journal from his brother that had passed away from tuberculosis, as he finds out from Henry before he dies. So he's sitting there, and you actually see some real emotion from Daniel for the first time, because he's getting drunk and he just can't believe that he'd been duped. I mean, I think it's all of those emotions swirled into one, that he had a brother, that his brother's now gone, that he felt that he could finally have some flesh and blood, as you mentioned before. Even the people that he has felt that have been close to him have never been flesh and blood, but there was somebody that was flesh and blood, and now that person is dead, he's finding out. This is a upheaval of his whole life right at this point. And then, he wakes up completely hungover. He's buried Henry, thankfully, but still, Bandy knows he killed him because he finds his gun, he displays it to Daniel, and he says, look, you're going to be saved. We're going to get you to go to the Church of the Third Revelation, which is Eli's thing. And you can see in Daniel's face, he's like, Jesus, no. And he's like, anything. I will give you $3,000. I'll give you $10,000. Whatever it would be, I'll give you any money just to not do this. Yeah. But ultimately, he succumbs because he'll do anything to get what he wants. So he tells Bandy, no problem. Let's do this. I want to build this track on your land. Then we get to one of the most incredible scenes of this entire movie, and I'm sure you have a lot to say about this. Daniel is literally in Eli's control. It's like a switch, because the last time we saw their confrontation, Eli's face was in the mud. Daniel was showing him, I'm in control, and now we know, because he needs to get his pipeline built, that Eli is back in control. If he does not get baptized in Eli's church, he can't have what he wants. So he sits there, gets up to the altar, and Eli is just looking down upon him and commanding him like a puppet. This scene with Daniel Day-Lewis is probably what got him the Oscar, amongst that final scene, I'm sure. And amongst maybe every scene of Daniel Day-Lewis in this movie. Listeners, if you're out there and you haven't seen this movie, go see it right now. Just for Daniel Day-Lewis's insane portrayal of this character. But he's sitting there. There's no way in hell he would be here ever if it wasn't for this one thing that he needs to get and to build the pipeline. So Eli is just doing what he wants. He's slapping him around, telling him to admit that you abandoned your son.
I have a question. How much was acting and how much was genuine, you think, for the character, for Daniel in this scene? Because he's obviously forced into it, as you just said, because of the Bandy tract. He needs to get the land, but then halfway through, it's not about the Bandy tract. He's legit admitting that he sent away his child.
And that's the genius of Daniel Day-Lewis in this scene, because there is a duality of it.
Yeah.
And that is inferred. That's inferred, but it's inferred by the acting choices that Daniel Day-Lewis made. Because you can see that he doesn't want to do it, but as he gets into it and as he's being taunted and able to finally let go of all the things he suppressed about HW, he can say, I've abandoned my boy, and literally proclaiming it to the world in what you believe is a truthful way, that he believes he did. But he would have never said it under any other circumstances but right here. And so he's sort of being cleansed in a way, even though he doesn't want to be there and doesn't want to do it. After this thing happens, the camera moves back into where the entrance would be of the church, and you can kind of see that all the people are ready to congratulate Daniel for being saved and going through this whole thing that Eli puts him through. And he goes up to Eli. We don't hear it. It's almost like Lost in Translation moment where Bill Murray talks to Scarlett Johansson and says something that's inaudible, and we're never going to know what it is. You see Daniel Plainview say to Eli something, and you can only guess at what he's saying. In my opinion, I think he's saying, I'm going to bury you, Eli. I'm going to, because he put him through this, But it's almost in the cordial way where he's shaking his hand, but I have to think that there's some malice that he said in his speech to him.
I definitely recognize that. Daniel looked like he was finishing a business transaction, and then Eli's reaction was kind of a little bit of both. He's celebratory. I feel like I truly just helped this man, even though that's a lie that Eli's telling himself. But at the same time, he does kind of have a grimace on his face where what did I just do? What have I actually just accomplished? I don't even know.
The look on his face was almost like, wow, did I just do something completely stupid because this man is going to come at me full force?
it really kind of like gets to a lot of what this movie means to me and what the two characters kind of represent. Kind of the way I see it is like religion is the past and money and capitalism is the present and the future. Daniel and Eli are both showmen. Eli has been selling the fantasy of the past, religion. Daniel doesn't need all that bullshit because he's an oilman and he's selling the fantasy of wealth and power in the present. People need oil more than they need religion. And I see this as kind of like, as you mentioned, the duality between the two characters, the past, the present, and the future.
Something I wanted to ask you, do you relate to the idea of competition in your life? Can you describe what that does to people a little bit, competition? Because that's a big part of this. These two men are talking about religion and talking about capitalism, and there's the competition between the two of them to get what they want. So do you relate to the idea of competition, and can you describe what that does to people? Is it a source of motivation or more of a recipe for disaster?
Humans are innately competitive. The second you're born, you're trying to get food to survive, and it's just kind of a natural component of our structure, of our hunter-gatherer DNA. But yeah, that's a good question. I think it comes out in the things that you're forced to worship. In this case, either religion or money, and whether or not that competition. I almost feel like competition in people is what it becomes the commodification. Is what the driver of creating wealth becomes in our society right now.
Yeah, and it's never enough, right?
No, that's definitely never enough. Well, it depends on who it makes money for, I'd say.
Right.
I mean, I think about that line all the time, actually, because it's like competition in yourself can inherently be a good thing. If you're competitive with yourself, to push yourself further, to push yourself with your personal goals. But I guess when it's that vulture capitalism that uses people's competition, where it's like, it's not just to fight for, a nicer house or a nicer car. It's to fight to survive and whether or not you're going to be able to feed yourself.
Right.
I think that's the cancerous component that they really get into here.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned at the end of the question is it something that's good for you, which you mentioned in your personal life, to have a little bit of a competition within yourself to be better at something or to push yourself in your work or whatever it might be, to be competitive against your peers in a good way, to sort of see what people have done around you and try to better it and grow. And also, I just saw a post by Paul McCartney this morning who put out a record and congratulating Taylor Swift on being number one, I think, in the UK or something like that, because they both have records that are out at the same time. And that's like good competition, because I think he realized a long time ago congratulating and being immersed in other people's successes is a good thing, really. But a lot of people don't believe that. I think a lot of people are the Daniel Plainviews who let it swirl and let it become more hate over time. And again, at the end of my question there, is it a recipe for disaster? I think it is for Daniel Plainview in this story, because his competition had cost him his son or any kind of people that could get close to him. And in the end, it's the classic, you have everything you could ever want, but look how miserable this man is. He will never admit that he's miserable. He would say, I'm fine and everybody else is screwed. I mean, you see that in Daniel Plainview at the end of this movie. It's like the guy is just shriveled up and sort of crouched over and can barely walk. It's like all of that hate and the things that are inside him have torn him apart and made him sort of crippled.
Yeah, he's certainly a shell of his former self, which wasn't even that much to begin with. So he eventually self-isolates. We get to a point where, 20 years later, he's got his mansion. He's basically achieved everything that he talks about. He's had enough money to get away from everybody. And all that's done is left him with a broken relationship with his son, who is starting his own business. And Daniel's first reaction, nothing else, is that, so you're my competitor.
Right. Yeah, he wants to go and start. HW is grown up, and he has married Mary that we had talked about earlier, Mary Sunday. So even almost that as him marrying the competition, which was the Sunday family.
Yeah, he's part of the Sunday family now, which always kind of went over my head. It's like, and you see this in the later scene coming up with Eli, and he says, "You're my brother," but he says it like in a hazardous way. But like you realize, like, oh, they actually are family now.
And that's one of those scenes where it's really hard to look at because he has to talk through a translator. As we know, he's become deaf, and really because of Daniel. The position that he put HW in, HW became deaf because of that. And again, we talked about how that has been a crux of Daniel's character since it happened. So he carries it along with him. You know that it's something he's definitely struggled with. And now he says, you have this guy talk for you all the time. Woof, woof, woof. And he finally talks out of his own mouth. And it's really important, that moment, because he's saying to Daniel before that in sign language, I'll always love you and all these things, and Daniel just doesn't care until he talks and kind of has to say from his own voice, like, I need to get away from you and I need to start it on my own. And then he just Daniel shuns him away and says, finally tells him, you were never mine, you were bastard in a basket, pronouncing that as he's walking out. Pretty sad. And that's really the end of it for me. Because Daniel is already, like you said, isolated in this castle of his own, and now he's got nothing. He doesn't even have HW, who's gone now to do his own drilling.
But who does he have? He's got Eli to show up for one final scene. So Eli shows up essentially begging for money, and Daniel is basically recognizing that and uses an opportunity to jam on him, making it admit that he's a false prophet, and
basically doing what he did to Daniel in that scene where he had to tell him that, my boy, I abandoned my boy. Now Daniel's like, okay, shoes on the other foot now. You need money. And he knew it before Eli walked in the door. But when Eli walked in the door, he, of course, is projecting this, like, everything's all good. I'm in radio now and all this kind of stuff. But Daniel knew the whole time. You think I don't know? Like, you're destitute. You need me right now.
God is a superstition. This is what Eli has to admit. He's still lying to himself. It would be false if I said that. And I love this scene so much. And then it heads to, I'm going to let you take the infamous line because you've been rocking the Plainview impersonations.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure that any podcast or anybody who's ever talked about this just loves to talk about this scene, and it's clear why. It is one of film history, not just recent film history, but in all of film history. I would say that this is probably one of the best scenes of all time. And it's Daniel Plainview just kind of saying, look, drainage. I drink your milkshake. I drink it up. And he's saying, I don't need what you're selling me because I've already got it. I got it. The drainage means that everything that was coming off, I kind of went around and got it a long time ago. And Eli's like, I want what was owed to me. And he comes there with these demands, just like he did that first time he came to Daniel about blessing the well. So, who wins at the end of this thing? I guess you could say nobody, but if you really want to talk about it, Daniel wins. It's the competition. Daniel wins the competition.
I mean, he certainly is the only one left alive. The closing line is, I'm finished. And I think I certainly agree that Daniel wins. And when I say Daniel wins, I mean money, and capitalism. Okay, so at one point, Daniel calls himself the third revelation in this final scene. And that's a callback to when Eli says that in his first exorcism scenes in his church, when he exorcises the demon from the old woman. He calls himself the third revelation at that point. So I love that they both, it's just a clear representation of how they view themselves as the third revelation. The first revelation was God handing down the 10 Commandments to people. The second revelation was Jesus' teachings to man. But the third revelation here is whatever man can sell the idea that they have the Spirit of God in them, the old and the new. Eli was trying to sell God. Daniel was trying to sell oil and money and wealth and power. And like I said, I think the fact is, with this movie and in kind of life right now, Daniel wins.
Even if you wanted to say, like, there's a moral character, there really isn't, because Paul Dano, first of all, I think the greatest casting choice on him is he's a little bit of he's definitely younger than Daniel, and he definitely seems like he's in over his head the whole movie. To me, he's a strong foil to him, but at the same time, he's a little bit like, you could say, like, this guy's just kind of like a scrappy, always trying, and he's never really accomplishing.
Eli is 100% a phony. He's selling God so that he can get money and power. You don't really see that overtly, and like you do kind of believe, like maybe he actually does believe in God and the words that he's saying, but I think it's pretty clear when you take a step back that Eli's character is as phony of a salesman and a showman as Daniel is. He's doing it for the power.
I guess that's the thing that unites the two characters, right?
Right.
Is that they're both putting on this show to try to get what they want, and in both cases, it's money and power. That's
kind of like sums up so much of what I love about it. It's like, to what degree do you get to choose what you worship? And I think that's actually a good question for this movie in general. It's like, depending on where you're born around the world or in America, or to what family you are born into, religion is often not a choice for people. For example, for Mary, it's like she was beaten if she didn't pray to God. So it's like she's not really getting a choice of what religion, or if she didn't want to subscribe to a religion. And as far as capitalism, you certainly don't have a choice for that matter. You may call yourself something else, a democratic socialist. You may not believe in capitalism or whatnot, and you can certainly work to move society in a different direction. But the truth is, if you live in this society and purchase things and have electricity in your home, you are a capitalist. It's like, to consume food that you purchase, drive a car, have shelter that's owned or rented, it's all in the marketplace. We're all capitalists right here and now, because that is how people are forced to attain the things that we need to survive. And so, summing this movie up in general, like especially this time around, it really made me ask the question, like, to what degree do you get to choose what you worship in order to get through your day?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, if you think in terms of the townspeople who really had no say in this, it's just that they lived in that particular place, and these two men are kind of dictating what's going to happen around them. They believe that they have some say because these people manipulate you to think that you're part of the conversation, but you're really not.
That's what it's all about, giving the illusion of control. Yeah.
Right. I did notice, like, Daniel sleeps on the floor so much, and I always wondered what that was. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I definitely think about it every single time. It's like, I assume it's him just passing out drunk. I mean, that's kind of...
Well, yeah, it's like almost like...
It might not be, but that's how I've always just kind of, like, assumed it because I didn't think about it anymore. So.
I don't think there's a real answer to that question, but so that's one of them that I think about. It's either passing out drunk, or I think it's sort of like he worked his fucking ass off. Like, you see him work hard. You can't debate that. And It's almost like he just falls asleep where he can, because the work is so important that, like, the sleep doesn't matter. It's just like you pass out when you're exhausted. Well, anyway, I think what you said before that was very strong, especially in terms of our podcast here, Remainders, and what we try to pull out of great works of art, such as There Will Be Blood, because it has something to say for sure about the world that we live in, about the foundation of the world that we live in, right? With this movie starting so early, and some of the early days of how someone would make money with the natural resources and what it does, oil being the lifeblood of so many things that still to this day, there's wars fought over. There's wars fought over to get control of oil because oil means money. That hasn't changed really much since the early days of digging for it. And religion hasn't changed much either. There's still wars fought over religion, aren't there? And it's something that is the basis and the foundation of the world, not just America, but the world. I'm not sure if this will ever go away. I guess maybe if we have more electric cars or something like that, their dependency on the resources like oil will diminish slightly, and maybe this will simmer down a little bit, but I don't know. I think it was an important story to tell because those things are still relevant, even though this film opens up in 1897.
Like I said, it's largely has to do with what you're forced to worship.
Like, people need something to believe in?
Really more of, not so much believe in, but like, what gives you the ability to get through your day.
Religion and ways to make money are always on the forefront of your mind when you wake up till you go to sleep. It's still a subject of conversation between your friends, and people are talking, especially now on social media, where people are trying to form ideas of how to make a buck,
capitalism is the major form of worship that we have right now. This movie doesn't necessarily dive too much into like inequality, but it certainly is the theme that kind of runs through it on a subsurface level, seeing how one person can accumulate so much wealth while so many other people toil away in poverty.
Well, it's right there in the milkshake line, you know.
Right.
If you have a milkshake and I have a milkshake, it's basically saying I can get your milkshake,
right.
Which is why that is such a great line, because it expresses it so clearly and so simply, almost like Paul Thomas Anderson's way of telling a story through someone's facial expressions. It's a simplicity, or the score like we talked about earlier. The simplicity in all of this helps you understand the story can be pretty complicated, just in human emotion, or things people can understand, like I can get to your milkshake and drain your milkshake without having to really do much.
That really is like the best image for capitalism that I can think of. Like every time I watch it, it's like I'm kind of blown away by like how simple it is, how well executed it is by Lewis, but then it being just a symbol for vulture capitalism. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about inequality in our society right now, and that's the theme of many aspects of the movie, as I said, but then it just keeps on reoccurring more and more to a higher degree in our lives right now. So it's like we're still deep in the middle of a pandemic right now, with millions of people out of work, many coming close to losing their homes. But you have the three richest people, Gates, Bezos, and Musk. I'm pretty sure the number is they've profited $270 billion since the start of the pandemic. I did the math. It's basically $800 million a day that they've been increasing their wealth every single day since the start of the pandemic. $800 million a day. Yes, they're drinking your fucking milkshake for sure.
That's one way to end a very complicated story, you know, and a way that it relates to so many things, even what we're going through right now in this pandemic. The rich keep on getting richer, and we're all the townspeople following whoever makes up the rules.
You're making me depressed, Darren.
Well, you know, that's one of the reasons why we do this, is so that we don't have to be depressed and we can talk about it and what we can do.
That's a really good way to put it. Just being conscious of your choices, as we talk about in this podcast a lot. And as I said earlier, being conscious of what you're being forced to worship, being religion, being capitalism, being how you spend your money, being how you spend your attention. I think that's important.
Do you need to go on Amazon every day and continually buy batteries or some other bullshit that really you don't need? I mean, you can really consciously think about the things that you have to have, the needs and the wants that you have in your life. I think during the pandemic, a lot of people would agree that they use their money for more wants than needs because they were bored. They didn't have some sort of creative outlet to fill their time. Well, we could go off the rails all day long and talk about this stuff, couldn't we, Pat? But I think so. We've had a good conversation about There Will Be Blood, and man, grateful to watch this again. One thing about this subject is that Paul Thomas Anderson has a lot of great movies. In fact, I don't think there's one movie of his I do not like.
Well, I wanted to ask you, it's like, is this your favorite Paul Thomas Anderson?
I would have to think a little bit more about that, because each one, like Phantom Thread, I think would be either close second or first. Phantom Thread, I think I understand more as far as somebody who's dedicated to doing what they got to do. And Phantom Thread talks so much about getting to the point where you have to be poisoned to stop you and halt you from working as hard as you do. Like, you literally have to be poisoned for it. So I think that movie I relate to more. And Boogie Nights, dude. I mean, come on.
Well, I was just going to say, like, it's either this, Boogie Nights, or Phantom Thread for myself as well. So I think we're actually kind of like right on the same page. Although the last couple times,
Magnolia, dude. I mean, nobody's talking about Magnolia.
I mean, it just shows how great Paul Thomas Anderson is.
Right.
Although I got to tell you, the last time I watched Punch Drunk Love, that keeps on moving up every single time I see it.
I know, and that was like a little under the radar Paul Thomas Anderson, I feel like. Maybe just the time it came out. I believe it was like 2001, 2002. That character, Adam Sandler's character, is super interesting. I'd love to go back and watch that again too.
It's a great example of how if you have a good director, you can even turn Adam Sandler into an amazing actor.
And we should note, too, if anybody hasn't seen the Fiona Apple video for Across the Universe, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, based on the 1998 movie Pleasantville, that's one that you should definitely watch. All one take, with the chaos of the scene. And if you remember the movie Pleasantville, of all of them, breaking into the diner and breaking it, she's in there, like, basically calm. The camera's on her the whole time, and the set moves around her as they're, like, bashing in the windows and, like, hitting the jukebox and taking the money out and, like, clearing the rack of all the milkshake. Not to talk about the milkshake again, but clearing all the milkshake glasses and breaking them. Beautifully directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, with a beautiful rendition of Across the Universe by Fiona Apple, which they both dated. I believe Magnolia was dedicated to Fiona Apple, which I love. All the years later, I think in 2012 or 2014 or something, she did another video that Paul Thomas Anderson directed while he had now been married to Maya Rudolph, for the song Hot Knife, which is also beautifully directed. So Paul Thomas Anderson, not just a great movie director, but also a great video director in his own right.
Love it. Definitely a legend in my eyes.
Legend for sure. And so much more left in him to go, which makes me excited about the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, with that, I believe that we'll wrap up our 6th episode of Remainders. Is that right? We've done 6 so far.
We're crushing it.
Yeah, and we are grateful for all of you out there listening, all the great comments. Keep them coming. Let people know however you can. We are all over social media at Remainders Pod, and we look forward to talking to you guys again next week.
Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to Remainders. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by Darren Burrell and Patrick McIntyre. Original music, episode art, logo, and editing by Darren Burrell. Find out what else remains by visiting our website at remainderspod.com. And we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search at RemainersPod. Please tell anyone you can about our show, and we look forward to telling you more of what remains next time.